picture the pitmaster in your head right now. Odds are you're seeing a bearded man in Texas, standing beside a $3,000 offset smoker, blue smoke curling up into a clear morning sky, a leather apron, and a line of customers around the block. That's the image barbecue sells today. But that image is barely 50 years old. The craft itself is older than the United States, and the people who actually built it, the ones who spent centuries perfecting the fire and the smoke and the patience, mostly died without anyone writing their names down. What nobody tells you at the backyard cookout is that American barbecue was raised on stolen labor and forgotten genius. It is arguably the most important contribution one group of people made to American food, and also the least credited. So today, we're going to do something simple. We're going to give those names back. 13 of them, counting down, and by the time we reach number 1, you'll never look at a plate of ribs the same way again. This story does not start in Texas, and it does not start with a stainless steel smoker. It starts with 3 continents colliding on the same patch of ground. Before we go further, we have to be honest about one thing, because the honesty is what makes the rest of it land. Barbecue was not invented by any single people out of thin air. It was a blend. The word and the wooden rack came from Indigenous Americans. The obsession with slow fire and cooking a whole animal came heavily from West and Central Africa. The hogs and some of the seasonings came from Europe. What we call Southern barbecue is what happened when all 3 of those worlds were forced together on the plantations of the American South. And here is the part that got buried. Within that blend, the hands doing the work, tending the fire through the night, turning the meat, mopping the sauce, were overwhelmingly the hands of enslaved Africans and their descendants. They took a fusion and made it a masterpiece. This is how it happened. Number 13. The word itself came from people we almost erased. Long before anybody argued about Texas versus Carolina, the technique had a name, and that name was not English. When Christopher Columbus and the Spanish who followed him landed in the Caribbean, they met the Taino, an Arawak people living across islands like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The Taino cooked and dried meat on a framework of green wooden sticks raised above a low, smoky fire. They called that structure something close to barabicu. A Spanish writer put the word barbacoa into print as early as 1526, describing exactly that. Say barabicu out loud a few times and you can hear it. Barbecue. Now, historians do argue about the details here, and it's worth being straight about that. Some scholars trace a clean line from the Caribbean rack straight up into the American South. Others argue that what became Southern barbecue was really born later, on American soil after enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, and that the Caribbean connection is mostly about the word rather than the method. Both camps agree on the thing that matters for our story. The name came from indigenous people, the technique was shared and blended across cultures, and none of it belonged to the European colonists, who would later take the credit. That detail matters more than it sounds. Because the Taino were among the first indigenous peoples the Europeans nearly wiped out. Within a century of contact, disease and violence had devastated them. And yet the first gift they gave the so-called New World kitchen was the name and the method for the food that would one day define American summers. Number 12. Barbecue was America's first melting pot, and the melting was done by force. By the time the technique traveled north from the Caribbean into places like Virginia and the Carolinas, it stopped being any one tradition. The indigenous method of cooking over a wooden rack or in an earth pit met the African mastery of fire and whole animal cooking, and it met European livestock, especially the pig. One of the earliest written glimpses of pork cooked this way in North America comes from 1540, when the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto sat down to a feast with the Chickasaw in what is now Mississippi. Spanish pork, indigenous fire. The blending was already underway before the first English colony was even planted. This tradition planted itself across an entire region that food historians sometimes call the barbecue belt, running roughly from Maryland down through the Carolinas and Georgia and all the way over to Mississippi. Different pockets of that belt slowly developed their own woods, their own meats, and their own sauces, and those differences are the distant ancestors of the great regional style wars we still argue about today. But underneath all of those regional flavors, from the Virginia Tidewater to the Deep South, the same basic engine was running. Slow fire, whole animals, and the hands of enslaved people doing the cooking. So barbecue was woven into the country from the very beginning, right alongside the founders and the campaigns and the celebrations. But somebody had to dig those pits. Somebody had to chop the wood, butcher the animals, and stand over the coals from midnight until the meat was ready at noon. And, on a plantation, that somebody was almost never the man giving the speech or the guest raising a glass. The credit went to the host. The work went to the enslaved. Number 11. Tending the pit was one of the hardest jobs on the plantation. We have romanticized barbecue so thoroughly that it's easy to forget what the old way actually demanded. There was no thermostat. There was no propane. There was no gauge on the side telling you the temperature. To cook barbecue the original way, you first dug a pit into the ground, sometimes several feet long, and you lined it. Then you cut and hauled the hardwood, and you burned it down to coals, and you started a fire that you could not walk away from for a single hour. Somebody had to butcher and quarter the animal, often a whole hog or a whole steer. And then somebody had to sit with it all night long, in the heat and the smoke. That labor was so heavy, so relentless, that the grand barbecue feasts of the Old South were only possible because enslaved people performed it. When a plantation threw a barbecue for a wedding, or a holiday, or an election, the joy belonged to the guests, and the sleepless, back-breaking work belonged to the people in bondage. There was no clocking out. There was no extra pay. There was just the fire and the long night and the expectation that the meat would be perfect by morning. And a single mistake, a fire allowed to flare too hot, a hog scorched or dried out, could bring punishment down on the very person who had done all the work. Imagine the pressure of that. Not the friendly pressure of a competition ribbon, but the real fear of what happened to enslaved people who disappointed the person who claimed to own them. That is the shadow standing behind every plate of perfectly smoked meat from that era. And this is the uncomfortable heart of it. The skill was being forged in the worst possible conditions. The patience that barbecue is famous for, the low and slow philosophy that pitmasters brag about on television today, was not a lifestyle choice back then. It was an overnight shift that nobody volunteered for, done under threat, with no rest. Historian Adrian Miller, whose book Black Smoke is the definitive record of all this, does not let us look away from it. He points out that the whole reason those enormous feasts could exist was the free, forced labor of the people at the pit. The craft and the cruelty grew up in the exact same place. You cannot honestly celebrate one without acknowledging the other. Number 10. They didn't just cook it, they perfected it. Here is where the story turns from tragedy into something closer to awe, because the people forced to do that work did not just endure it, they mastered it. By the 1700s, according to Miller's research, enslaved African Americans had become the go-to cooks for Southern pit barbecue across the region. Not the assistants, not the helpers, the authorities. If you wanted the best barbecue in a county, you wanted the enslaved man or woman known for it, and everyone around, black and white alike, knew exactly whose fire to trust. Over roughly 2 centuries, generation after generation refined the entire system. They developed the mop sauces, the vinegar and pepper bastes that kept the meat from drying out over a 12-hour cook. They worked out which woods gave which flavor, how hickory differs from oak, how fruit woods sweeten the smoke. They learned how to read a fire in the dark, how to hold a steady low heat all night with nothing but instinct and experience and a stick to move the coals. They figured out timing and doneness by touch, by the way the meat pulled, by smell. This was culinary science being worked out in real time by people who were never allowed to write a cookbook, never credited in a newspaper, never paid a dime for the intellectual property they were creating. Think about that. An entire body of technical knowledge, the foundation of a cuisine, developed and stored and improved entirely through memory and demonstration, because the law forbade many of these people from even learning to read. When you hear a modern pitmaster talk about feel, about just knowing when the meat is ready, understand where that language was born. It was passed hand to hand, in whispers and over shoulders, by people who owned nothing, not even themselves, and who still managed to build one of the great cooking traditions on earth. Number 9. Whole hog wasn't a style, it was survival. There's a reason so much of old Southern barbecue centers on the whole hog, and on the cuts that nobody else wanted. Enslaved cooks and later sharecroppers were rarely handed prime meat. They got what was left after the good cuts went up to the main house. So they learned to make the tough, the fatty, and the downright strange taste incredible. On the pit went whole hogs, but also goats and sheep, and when times were hardest, possum, raccoon, and groundhog. Nothing was too humble to smoke. Nothing was wasted. If it had meat on it, it went over the fire, and it came off delicious. That necessity is exactly what shaped the flavor of America, cooking the whole animal low and slow, which is now sold as the purest, most respected form of the craft. The thing competition judges swoon over started as a way to stretch what little you had into a meal that could feed everybody. The reason those tough cuts turned tender is time and smoke, and time and smoke were free. What money couldn't buy, patience could. And here's a detail that surprises even seasoned barbecue people. The smaller cuts we obsess over now, like brisket and spare ribs, only became standard barbecue fare around the turn of the 20th century. For most of this history, barbecue did not mean a rack of ribs on a backyard grill. It meant the whole beast, cooked in a pit dug into the earth, feeding a whole community at a single gathering. Adrian Miller points out that almost any animal could and did end up on the pit. Cattle usually cooked in quarters, along with goats, sheep, and whatever else was available. The individual cut barbecue we know is the recent version. The idea of ordering a half rack for yourself would have seemed strange to a 19th century pitmaster feeding 200 people at once. The genius was in the scarcity. When you're handed the worst and told to make it work, and what you make ends up feeding a nation for 300 years, that is not just cooking. That is alchemy performed under the worst circumstances imaginable. And the people who performed it deserve to be a whole lot more than a footnote in somebody else's cookbook. If this story matters to you, take a second to subscribe, because this channel exists to keep exactly this kind of history from being lost. Now, let's talk about the people themselves, because it is finally time to say some names out loud. Number 8. Mary John bought her freedom, one barbecue at a time. For most of the people in this story, history recorded no name at all. They cooked, they fed thousands, and they vanished from the record entirely. But not all of them. In the 1840s in Arkansas, there was an enslaved woman named Mary John who, in the language of the time, superintended barbecues. Strip away the old-fashioned phrasing, and here is what that actually means. She ran the pit, she was in charge, she was, in every way that counts, a pitmaster decades before that word carried any prestige at all. And Mary John did something almost unthinkable given her circumstances. Using what she earned from her barbecue skill, she eventually bought her own freedom. Sit with the sheer scale of that for a moment. A woman held in bondage was so extraordinarily good at cooking over fire that her labor generated real money, enough money over time to purchase her way out of slavery itself. That single fact quietly demolishes two big myths at once. First, it tells you that black barbecue entrepreneurship did not begin after emancipation, the way the tidy version of history suggests. It was already happening under slavery, wherever an enslaved person was skilled enough, and trusted enough, and determined enough to be hired out or paid for the work on the side. Second, it tells you that the pit was, for a rare and lucky few, the narrow path toward freedom itself. Adrian Miller found more than one story like hers, enslaved people using barbecue proceeds to purchase themselves or their family members out of bondage. There is no statue of Mary John. There is no holiday in her name. Most people will go their entire lives never hearing that she existed. But every single time you smell smoke coming off a pit, she is part of the reason it smells like that. Number 7. The best pitmasters in America were often women. Ask most people to picture a legendary pitmaster, and they will picture a man. The whole culture is marketed as a kind of rugged boys' club. Fire, meat, beard, tongs, a truck. That image is not just incomplete, it is historically wrong. Mary John was not some rare exception to the rule. Across the record, again and again, the finest barbecue cooks in a given place were women. Enslaved women and later free black women ran pits, developed the sauces, and built reputations that pulled hungry people in from miles around. This makes complete sense the moment you think about it honestly. Cooking was assigned to enslaved women constantly, as a matter of course, which meant that the deepest, most refined culinary knowledge on a plantation often lived with them. They were the ones who understood seasoning, timing, the exact balance of a sauce, and the feel of a fire, not as a weekend hobby, but as a daily craft they were forced to perfect under pressure. When barbecue later became a business with money attached, plenty of those same women were the ones with the actual expertise. Even in the many cases where a man's name is the one that ended up over the door and in the history books. Adrian Miller makes a point of this because it upends the entire modern marketing of barbecue. He found so many top-notch women barbecuers in the historical record that it genuinely surprised him, and it should surprise anyone raised on the beard and tongs version of the story. These were not novelties. They were the reigning experts of their communities. Some of them stayed up through the night before a big event, cooking and basting the meats hour after hour, and then watched men carry the platters out to the applause. The cookbook author and food historian Jessica B. Harris, who won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the James Beard Foundation, has written about exactly this world. The black women whose overnight labor and inherited skill fed the South for generations. So the next time somebody tells you barbecue is a man's world, you can tell them the honest truth. Some of the greatest hands ever to touch a pit in this country belong to black women whose names the record keepers simply couldn't be bothered to write down. Reclaiming the real history of barbecue means reclaiming them too, right alongside the kings. Number 6. They were called barbecue kings, and then they were forgotten. In the 1800s, the great pitmasters had a title, and it was a good one. People called them barbecue kings. It was a genuine form of local celebrity. A famous barbecue man could be sent for from towns away to cook the biggest events of the year, and enormous crowds would gather around a single pit, specifically because of who was tending it. The pitmaster was the draw. Two of them are worth remembering by name tonight. There was a man everyone knew as Old Arthur Watts. He had once been forced to keep the fires burning on a Missouri plantation, the very definition of the unpaid overnight labor we talked about earlier. After Emancipation, he became a legendary barbecue man in central Illinois, and he lived remarkably to be 107 years old. Think about the span of that life. A man born into slavery who kept plantation fires, who then carried that craft into freedom and cooked for decades as a celebrated master. A living bridge stretching from bondage all the way deep into the 20th century. And there was Columbus B. Hill, who left West Tennessee for Denver in the late 1870s and became famous for cooking barbecue for thousands of people at a time. These men were stars in their communities. In their own moment, they were as known and as respected for their barbecue as any celebrity chef is on television now. But because they were black, and because the people writing the official histories didn't consider their work to be art worth recording, their fame died with the generation that ate their food. That is the quiet tragedy running underneath this entire thing. It's not only that these people were exploited while enslaved, it's that even after freedom, even when they became beloved, even when a whole region literally called them kings, the culture still let their names slip quietly away. We are only getting them back at all right now because a handful of scholars refused to let them stay lost and went digging through old records to find them. Number 5. Emancipation turned skill into ownership. When slavery finally ended, the skill did not disappear with it. It walked off the plantation, and for the first time in American history, it could actually belong to the person who possessed it. This is one of the most powerful turns in the entire story, and it deserves a real pause. Newly freed black men and women took the one thing they had been allowed, even forced, to become genuine experts in, and they built whole livelihoods out of it. Some of the very first commercial barbecue in America came directly from these freed pitmasters. They set up roadside stands. They cooked for church gatherings and community picnics. They fed entire neighborhoods. And slowly, steadily, a craft that had been the definition of forced labor transformed into proud, black-owned enterprise. Think about what that transformation meant, not just economically, but emotionally. The same fire that had once kept you awake all night as somebody else's property could now, in freedom, put money in your own pocket and food on your own family's table. It could put your name over a door. It could give you standing and respect in your community. In a post-war South that locked black families out of nearly every other path to wealth and dignity, barbecue became one of the very few economic ladders actually available to climb. It fed people, yes, but just as importantly, it built independence, ownership, and a foundation that could be passed down to children. Barbecue also became the beating heart of black community life in a way that went far beyond money. The church barbecue, the Juneteenth celebration, the political rally, the Emancipation Day gathering, all of them ran on smoke and slow-cooked meat. When a community needed to raise funds, feed a crowd, or simply come together in freedom, someone lit a pit. And as the pitmasters spread out and set up in new places, their sauces and rubs and mops evolved and split and multiplied, which is a big part of why a vinegar sauce in eastern North Carolina tastes nothing like a thick, sweet tomato-based sauce somewhere else. That diversity of flavor we celebrate today grew out of black cooks adapting, experimenting, and making the craft their own, now that it finally was their own. And as black Americans began to move in the decades that followed, that hard-won independence and that smoke was about to travel a very long way from the plantation south. Because the pit was no longer tied to one piece of land or one master's whim. It had become something portable, something a family could carry with them. It was about to become a national inheritance, and it was about to build cities. Number 4. Henry Perry built Kansas City's barbecue empire out of a tent. If you want the single clearest example of how all of this comes together, his name was Henry Perry. He was born in Shelby County, Tennessee, in 1874, less than a decade after slavery ended, a child of exactly the world we've been describing. As a teenager, he learned to cook in the kitchens of Mississippi River steamboats, working the water, moving from town to town, and absorbing the craft as he went. Eventually, he made his way to Kansas City, first taking work as a porter, and by 1908, he had started selling smoked meats to workers in the downtown garment district. Before long, he was tending a brick-lined pit dug straight into the ground near 18th and Vine, in the heart of the city's black neighborhood, the very same district that was becoming one of the great jazz capitals of the world. Picture that corner, smoke and music pouring out into the same streets. And Perry, never a man short on confidence, started calling himself the barbecue king right there from his tent and his stand. He earned the crown. People traveled from other cities entirely just for his food, drawn by an aroma that customers said stayed with them and pulled them back again and again. He was as much a shrewd businessman as he was a cook, and by several accounts, his real gift was as much marketing as meat. His barbecue itself was not for the faint of heart. Perry cooked cheap cuts, and his sauce was famously harsh and peppery, the kind of thing that made your eyes water. He understood barbecue as spectacle, as community, and as generosity. On at least one 4th of July, Henry Perry fed around 1,000 people for free. It's worth remembering, too, that the road was not easy even for the king. In interviews, he admitted there were stretches when the barbecue barely paid, when he thought about quitting and taking a regular wage, but he always drifted back to the little tent and started another fire under another piece of meat. By the time of the 1930s census, when the government asked him to state his occupation, Perry answered with a single, perfect word: barbecue. That was the whole of it. That was his life, plainly and proudly stated. When he died in 1940, he left behind far more than a successful business. He left behind an entire city's identity. Kansas City stands as one of the barbecue capitals of the world today, and that is not some accident of geography or luck. It is the direct, traceable legacy of one black man, the son of the post-slavery South, who turned a pit and a tent into a kingdom. Number 3. Every famous Kansas City joint traces back to one black man. Here is the part that honestly should be on a plaque somewhere downtown. Henry Perry didn't just build his own name and his own stand. He built the entire lineage that followed him. One of the men who learned Perry's method directly was named Arthur Pinkard. Pinkard went on to become the pitmaster at a place called Old Kentuck Barbecue. And when a couple named George and Arzelia Gates bought that business, Pinkard came along with it and personally taught them the craft that Perry had taught him. That business became Gates Barbecue, one of Kansas City's absolute crown jewels, still going strong across multiple locations. And to this day, a framed photograph of Arthur Pinkard hangs in every single one of them. That is a lineage honoring itself. Perry's influence runs straight into Arthur Bryant's too, the other legendary Kansas City name, a place that has fed presidents and been called by some the best restaurant in the country. It was the Bryant side of the family that eventually took Perry's fierce, peppery original sauce and softened it into the sweeter, tomato-based style that most people now think of as Kansas City barbecue. So, even the flavor that defines the city is a direct evolution of one man's recipe. And as for Arthur Pinkard, the pitmaster who carried the torch, he worked his pit for decades before retiring. Moved to St. Louis and died there in 1963, his photograph still hanging on the walls of the empire he helped build. Trace the smoke back far enough, past the famous sauces and the neon signs, and the whole city keeps pointing back to the same source: Henry Perry. Number 2. Then the credit quietly drifted away. So how does a craft this profoundly black end up marketed to the whole country by an image that is mostly white? It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened slowly, quietly, over generations. And it happened for the same reasons this kind of erasure usually does. As barbecue got commercialized across the 20th century, as it moved off the community pit and into cookbooks and glossy magazines, and eventually television networks, the people telling the story more and more often were not the people who had actually lived it and built it. The historian Michael Twitty, who wrote the award-winning book The Cooking Gene, has pointed out something that cuts right to the bone. His own formal education framed his enslaved ancestors as unskilled laborers, unskilled, as if standing over a pit through the night for 300 years, developing sauces and reading fires and building an entire cuisine from the scraps you were given required no skill whatsoever. That single word, and the misframing behind it, tells you almost everything about how the erasure worked in practice. If you call it labor instead of art, then you never have to give anyone real credit for it. You get to treat the cook as a tool instead of a genius. By the time barbecue exploded into a billion-dollar national obsession, the famous faces smiling out from the covers and the cooking shows were very often the newcomers, the competition champions and the celebrity restaurateurs who arrived generations after the foundation was already poured. The founders, meanwhile, were left back in the footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Now, this is not a story about cartoon villains twirling their mustaches. Plenty of people along the way simply repeated the tidy version of history they were handed, never knowing any better. But intentions aside, the effect was very real and very complete. The men and women who invented, refined, and preserved this craft were slowly and thoroughly written out of the picture of the very thing they had created. It stands as one of the quietest and most total acts of cultural forgetting in all of American food. And for a very long stretch, almost nobody with a platform was pushing back on it. That, at long last, has finally started to change. Number 1. The fire never went out. The best news in this entire story, the reason it doesn't end in sorrow, is that the erasure did not win. Not completely, not permanently. In kitchens and backyards and roadside pits all across the country, the tradition quietly survived, passed down inside families who never once stopped cooking the old way, whether or not the magazines or the networks ever bothered to notice them. The fire kept burning in the places that mattered most. And now finally, a new generation is dragging the real history back up into the light, where it belongs. Rodney Scott, who grew up cooking whole hogs the old-fashioned way in South Carolina, went on to win a James Beard Award, one of the very highest honors in all of American food. And in doing so, he put whole hog barbecue back on the national stage, where it always deserved to be. Scott started young, working the pits at his family's store as a boy of around 11, learning the all-night whole hog method the way it has always been taught, by doing it beside someone older. Ed Mitchell, in North Carolina, has spent decades loudly championing that same whole hog tradition and insisting that the world remember the black pitmasters standing behind it, becoming a public face for a style that was in danger of being forgotten. And scholars like Adrian Miller and Michael Twitty have done the patient, unglamorous work of writing the names back into the permanent record one by one, so that people like Mary John and Henry Perry and old Arthur Watts can never simply be forgotten again. Miller's book Black Smoke goes further than almost anyone had before, profiling unsung black barbecue trailblazers across 3 full centuries and even collecting their recipes, so the knowledge itself survives on the page. There is a real urgency to all of this, and it's worth being honest about. Some of the very oldest traditions, like the true whole hog barbecue of West Tennessee, are genuinely at risk of dying out entirely as the last of the old pitmasters pass on. Every single time one of them goes without passing the knowledge to someone younger, another irreplaceable piece of this 300-year inheritance goes into the ground with them. So this reclamation is not only about giving credit for the past, it is about keeping the fire physically, literally alive into the future. And that fire, the real one, the original one, was lit, intended, and perfected by people who were never once free to claim it as their own. Keeping it burning and saying their names while we do is how we finally start to pay them back. So let's go all the way back to where we started tonight. That bearded man in Texas with the expensive smoker, the picture that pops into your head the instant somebody says the word pitmaster. He is real, and a great many like him are genuinely wonderful at what they do. This was never about tearing him down, but he is standing on a foundation that was poured by people whose names he may well have never heard, by an enslaved woman in Arkansas who cooked her way to her own freedom, by a man who kept plantation fires as a slave and lived to 107 as a celebrated free master of the craft, by a king who built the soul of an entire city out of nothing but a tent and a pit in the ground. American barbecue was not handed down from nowhere, and it did not spring from a suburban backyard. It was invented, refined, and kept alive across centuries by enslaved people and their sharecropping descendants, and then it was quietly borrowed by a country that forgot to say thank you. The great writer Zora Neale Hurston once suggested that all of us who never get the chance to meet again in this life might someday finally meet at a barbecue. If there's any truth to that, then the next time you find yourself standing over a fire, watching that thin blue smoke curl up into the sky, take 1 second to remember whose hands first taught yours how to do it. And if it was your own family who kept a pit, kept a sauce, kept the fire alive through all of that history, then this isn't just American history to you. It's yours. So tell me about them down in the comments. Say their names out loud, because that, more than anything else, is how we make absolutely sure the smoke never clears.